I want to welcome everybody to the 19th Century Charitable Association in Oak Park, where it is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. Good afternoon. I am Judy Eckberg, Chair of the Social Science Program Committee. Our program committees have scheduled 29 enrichment programs in this series this year, and it's part of our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Our speaker today is Dr. James Walter. Jim has retired from medical research at Hines VA Hospital and an appointment in urology at Loyola Medical Center. He became involved in evolutionary psychology with the publication of Harvard professor Dr. Richard Wrangham's fourth book, The Goodness Paradox, which describes the evolution of our psychology through mobile hunter-gatherer bands through the end of the last ice age. Jim and a colleague have published 3 reviews of the book, and Jim has given several talks to local humanist groups. These organizations are secular in outlook and have provided great advice. He looks forward to discussing the recent anthropological findings as they relate to our psychological evolution. Please welcome Dr. James Walter.
The title of today's talk is The Evolution of Human Language, Aesthetics, and Free Will. And this will be explained through the thesis shown on the right. The origin of all of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors is from natural selection, from 4 behaviors and their mortal and reproductive dangers. And this occurred in mobile hunter-gatherer bands before the end of the last ice age. So the 4 behaviors in these ancient hunter-gatherer societies were egalitarianism, breakers of egalitarianism, targeting the breakers, maintain the egalitarianism and produce the natural selection for our psychology, and avoiding the targeting added to the selection. The inspiration for this talk today is the book, The Goodness Paradox by Richard Wrangham. Dr. Wrangham is a Harvard professor, primatologist, and anthropologist, and he's watching this talk today on Zoom, and he hopes to join in during the discussion. So we published 4 reviews. My 3 colleagues that I've worked with, Ozma Khan isn't here today, but Charles Hamaker and Darren Nerid are here. The 4 behaviors that occurred in the mobile hunter-gatherer bands, the timeline is there in red. So the 4 behaviors were developing prior to 35,000 years ago when our language abilities were developing. They were in full force between the 135,000 and the 12,000 years, and they're considered not to be active in our modern lives. So let's go and detail these different earmarks in black. At 300,000 years ago are our first skeletons obtained as fossils in Africa, Morocco. At 135,000 years ago, language abilities are predicted to have been pretty much in full abilities. 75,000 years ago, first symbolic and conceptual art in ochre. 65,000 years of expansion, funerary practices, artwork, complex behaviors. 50,000 years ago, migrations out of Africa, and all people are related due to those migrations. We're particularly interested at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago. All people living on Earth were living as mobile hunter-gatherer bands, and they produced these high-quality artifacts. This is a cave painting from France, beautiful painting, and at the bottom, the blade bifacial napping. Such that it's generally agreed by everyone that all of our psychological abilities had evolved by the end of the last ice age. So, that's a long time ago, 12,000 years ago. And, how are you going to find out the psychological processes that were occurring back then? And so that's been a major problem up until recently, when they found that hunter-gatherers living today that have lived in total isolation from farming and modern society since the end of the last ice age, and were making the same artifacts as they were making at the end of the last ice age. So they determined that they represented life and people before the end of the last ice age. And so the studies were conducted in these current hunter-gatherer societies, with the idea of, describing them, but to really determine what were the natural selection processes that produced our psychology, that produced why we are the way we are. And at the top, the studies were done by anthropologists over 10 to 20 years, represents some of the names of the bands and the anthropologists conducting the work. In the middle box there, we see what's typically known of hunter-gatherers. You're probably familiar with it. The men are hunting during the day. In the second picture, women are gathering and childcare. And the picture on the right shows a woman cooking the evening meal. That's the basic, organization of mobile hunter-gatherers. So in the studies, they were really looking for the natural selection process. So they measured daily activities, psychology, and of course for natural selection, you want to know survival and reproduction. So at the bottom, just kind of characterizing what they found. One there, famine, disease, and warfare were a constant threat for life at this time. They had an active social life, singing, 30 or 40 in a band, and arranged marriages. Animist thinking dominated, and it was used in most arguments. There were shamans. And the Married Men's Coalition had the most influence. They set the egalitarian norms, which tended to benefit the men, such as polygamy. So let's go on and talk about the natural selection that caused our psychology to really explain why we are the way we are today. They found 4 behaviors that caused this. And Wrangham used different terminology for the 4 behaviors. He called it the Wrangham-Bowen model, or the execution hypothesis. So the first the 4 behaviors is egalitarianism, and that occurred within the band. It didn't extend to outsiders. It produced the organization of the bands that was cooperative, sharing, and that the group had control over the individual. The egalitarian norms, which were set by the men and supported by the married women, established the egalitarian norms. The second behavior was egalitarian problem. And this occurred with norm breakers, anger, aggression, bullies, stealing, things like that. It was really observed by all of the anthropologists in all of the hunter-gatherer societies that this was a major problem. And there were other sources of the problem. The shamans could identify a problem for almost any reason, and sometimes there were less obvious reasons. So the third behavior is targeting of norm breakers and natural selection. Targeting was with planned coalitional aggression, consisted of 2 behaviors: gossip, derision, and ostracism. Those that were targeted really faced isolation in the community and starvation. The others was actually executions within the band, which they observed one every, say, 3 to 4 years. The shaman would identify a sorcerer. That was somebody that's, breaking the egalitarian norms. And the executions would occur weeks later by ambush. And this maintained the egalitarianism. B, those targeted had shorter lives and fewer progeny. And so this was strong natural selection pressure for our psychological traits. There were mortal and reproductive risks that was associated with this. So 3, this decreased the anger, aggression in the population, through natural selection, and increased other psychological traits such as language, conscience, personality, etc. The 4th and last behavior was avoiding being targeted and its effects. So everybody in the hunter-gatherer band was aware of the dangers of being targeted, and they tried to perform and behave in ways that they would not be targeted. One, they had good talking, exemplary behaviors, gaining influence, and coalition. 2, the targeting actually extended over days or weeks, so any language and behaviors affected the outcomes. 3, avoiding targeting produced increased natural selection for all the psychological traits, language, conscience, aesthetics, etc. And 4, this 4th behavior added to the mortal and reproductive risks associated with the 4 behaviors. So here's the summary of the results from the hunter-gatherer band studies. And we kind of, in our publications, we introduced this rating of psychological abilities. And we used a 5-point rating scale from very low to very high. And we could start down in the left-hand corner in black there. Really a surprising find that there were no significant effects on psychology from predator-prey or reproductive natural selection processes. Now, those are the processes that establish all adaptations in all other animals. So it's a very striking to say, oh, look, in our recent evolution for our psychology, these processes were insignificant. In contrast, they found that these 4 behaviors that we've been talking about, with their mortal and reproductive dangers, produced this extremely strong natural selection that caused the evolution of all of our psychological abilities. So in the right is a summary of those types of evolutionary adaptations. And here are just 9 of our psychological abilities. We're really trying to represent everything we could think of was, to really characterize our psychology. And a rating is on the right there, and this is really for the end of the Ice Age. That these hunter-gatherers are being studied to represent life at the end of the last Ice Age and today, with the idea that generally thinking is our psychology has not changed since the end of the last Ice Age. Planned coalitional aggression is put in red there because this is the driving force behind all of the other psychological adaptations. Planned coalitional aggression is the 3rd of the 4 behaviors. And the planned coalitional aggression is associated with those dramatic features of, gossip and ostracism, and in some cases, execution. I mean, this is, in evolutionary terms, this is total mortality and reproduction, and this is why it was having such a big impact. And so, really, all of our other psychological abilities, I think we left 9 of them listed there, all grew out of selection from the planned coalitional aggression. And in these hunter-gatherer societies, this is very high. And it is very high today. We have, coalitional thinking, and it is considered an aggression. So, and the planned coalitional aggression is really tied closely to the anger aggression, and kind of his background. He's really in his book. He's talking about chimpanzees hitting very often, like 500 times more than we do. So that really early on in our hominid and early evolution, hitting anger aggression was still going to be a major problem, if not the major problem in human evolution. And it's really the planned coalitional aggression that's selected for lower anger aggression, such that we say today our anger aggression is very low. For example, you're sitting next to your neighbor there without any feeling whatsoever of aggression. Now, if you were a chimpanzee, that is the primary stimulus to fight. Close association, just getting close to another one, is the signal for fighting. And so that's why we rate that as anger aggression is very low. Conscience was the next big one that Dr. Wrangham writes about in his book. That why do we have such conscience abilities? We're not only worried about our own behavior, but we're really worried about the behavior of our neighbors. And but that makes lots of sense from the point of view of these mortal dangers from the four behaviors. You had to be very conscience oriented to avoid breaking the moral norms of the society and being targeted. The next three, personality, learning, cognition, social awareness, you're all familiar with those, and those are all rated the same as very high. Language, aesthetics, and free will, from the title of the topic of the title of the talk today, are also rated as very high, and we'll talk more about those. But really they evolved, and we have, especially like our amazing language abilities, because of the natural selection from the four behaviors, is Dr. Wrangham's argument that we're supporting. So with that I&D in mind, the next slide really drives home how strong this natural selection pressure is. So in this, we were the first to publish this in one of our papers, comparing the natural selection pressure that's going on in these hunter-gatherers from the four behaviors to typical mammalian natural selection pressures. And we picked the giraffe's neck and the elephant's trunk. So based on Wrangham's hitting rate, and there's quite a few arguments that go into this. And our paper is on the back table there. You can pick it up. It has all the details of the argument, many arguments that go into estimating these. And we came up with this amazingly high natural selection pressure of 165-fold change in our reactive aggression, decrease in our reactive aggression at a rate of per million years, 165. The next, you see there, the typical mammalian adaptations, the giraffe's neck and the elephant's trunk, was estimated over, they took like 12 million years or 7 million years to occur based on the fossils. And so it's calculated there per million years. And the average is only 0.2-fold per million years. So this, we calculated the relative natural selection pressure, which is our aggression pressure versus the typical mammalian. And we come up with this astronomically high number of 825 times more natural selection pressure that was going on in these in the life of the Homo sapiens before the end of the last ice age for our psychological abilities. And once you get numbers that are even above 20 or 30, you can say, oh, this is the only important thing that's going on. Everything else can be ignored. The possible percentage from other factors becomes so small. And with numbers like 800, you say, oh, this is what caused our nature. And it's a primary argument in saying that our aesthetic and language abilities came from the four behaviors before the end of the last ice age. Going on. So let's go to part 2 and of the four behaviors, and let's look at the extended timeline to get a little bit more background on this, to really try to convince you that this is really what's going on. And it's behind, as you're sitting there feeling nervous or anything like that, it's really explaining that this is the way or why you're feeling that way. And then we'll go through the chimpanzees, our four hominin relatives, and then Homo sapiens today. So This is from Dr. Wrangham's book. This is really the best chapter I've ever read on the chimpanzee. And, it really explains what's going on here. And at 7 million years ago, we had the common ancestor, which is predicted to be essentially the same as today's chimpanzee. So all of the differences that we see between us and the chimpanzee really occurred only in our line. And so it's a very important comparison to think about comparing us to the chimpanzee, because all the differences are from our evolutionary line. So we're looking at the body. So these are occurring in Africa, rainforest. It's a large primate. And large fruit is what it's eating. It has a larger brain, taking lots of energy. And the chimpanzee spends all day long running around in the woods trying to find these large fruits. They're essentially evolved to eat large fruits. So the mind, think about the mind. Here we start with the 500 times more hitting is occurring in the chimpanzee troop than is occurring in our societies, our human societies today. So it's a wonderful, study on this, looking, worldwide, getting estimates for humans, estimates for chimpanzees. And so he's really saying, in our psychological evolution, how evolution managed this 500 times is extremely important. Once you get high aggression, you cannot get evolution of intelligence. The chimpanzees can't even sit close to us. They can't really have social relationships to any extent. Unless this aggression is driven down, you really can't get the evolution of our, intelligence. So they have very limited language, very limited conscience. They live in troops, and they have highly stereotyped behavior. They have very limited learning and culture. And really their behaviors are described as complex reflex behaviors. And they're driven by triggers. For example, in the early morning, the sun comes up, that's a trigger to go foraging. That's what they do all day long. Forage and rest, forage and rest. Another trigger is, as I mentioned before, just closeness to each other triggers fighting. And then they fight until one of them runs off or one of them kills another one. Then in red there, the natural selection is really what we're, interested in today. That's, causing all of these adaptations. So in the chimpanzee, we say predator-prey and reproductive processes define the natural selection that cause the adaptations that the chimpanzee have. The 4 behaviors that we're interested in are not present. There's no language, there's no extensive communication that would be needed to conduct the 4 behaviors. I mean, just think how complex the 4 behaviors are. Far more complex than anything that ever happens in any other animal on Earth. So let's go on to the hominids. We have 4 major hominids. Lucy at 3.2 million, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis at 0.8. And what's happening in our hominid evolution? Of course, as you know, Africa was cooling and drying, and the common ancestor from what we had with the chimpanzee was moving out of the tropical forests into the wood and savanna habitats. They're evolving opposable thumb, upright walking, body size increased by 2, and there was a decrease in the difference between females and males, which is a marker in biology of domestication syndrome. Domestication syndrome is kind of complicated. Just to mention it, you're all familiar with the domesticated syndrome. All of our cats and dog pets are a result of the domestication syndrome, which makes them less aggressive and more friendly. And so in our evolution, this is a very important marker of decreased aggression that's going on in the hominids. So they're eating tubers and later cooked food and meat. So let's look at the mind of the hominids. They increased 3 times in brain size. They have the stone tools, advanced stone tools, butchering, cooking, cooperating. Reduced anger aggression is being shown. So it's domestication syndrome indications is being shown also. But there are increases in what we would call a proto-language or proto-conscience before it's fully developed, in our Homo sapien ancestors. So the natural selection here in red in the bottom is that there's reduced predatory prey and reproduction processes, and there's the introduction of proto-4 behaviors with the limited selection. And the next slide is for us Homo sapiens, and look at the time scale there. The first fossils at 300,000 years ago, 135,000, as we mentioned before, is the timing of language near full development. And 12,000 years ago is the end of the last ice age. And during this time, there's a remarkable response to our bones from the fossils are decreasing by about 8%, which is a particularly strong measure of the domestication syndrome. So it's showing there was an extreme decrease in reactive aggression, anger, and fighting during this time. For the mind, as you know, as we live today, people start living in families. They were hunter-gatherers. There was this decreased anger, aggression. There was increases in language, conscience, and really full development of all psychological abilities occurred during this time. So the natural selection in red, there's predator, prey, and reproductive. There's really not present at all. And the full 4 behavior selection pressure becomes complete, and our psychology becomes completely evolved. So that's at the end of the last 12,000 years. And just to mention, in the 12,000 years of, we've had farming in the modern ages, they say essentially, our body's unchanged. And our mind, our psychology has also been essentially unchanged. Now we move from the egalitarian societies before in the hunter-gatherers to the hierarchical societies that we live in farming in modern ages. So we're capable of the 4 behaviors, but they're just not active. You really need to depend on the egalitarianism organization of the society to have the 4 behaviors. And Ryan, you have to read his book. He has a whole chapter on explaining why our psychology has not changed since the end of the last ice age. So here again, I think we were the first in our publications to summarize this assessment of our psychological abilities at the 4 different time periods using the same rating scale. And again, on the left there, we're just trying to kind of indicate all of our psychological abilities. And it starts with the chimpanzee, our common ancestor from 7 million years ago. And as we've been talking, their anger aggression is very high. Their planned coalitional aggression, which is a measure of the 4 behaviors, is very low. Conscience is very low. They don't have language abilities to develop the conscience. And the other 6 traits, again, you can read them there, are also very low. At 300,000 years ago, it's as I previously said, that the 4 behaviors are developing at this time, and so that the anger aggression moves from a rating of very high to high. And we've got quite a few arguments for this in our publication that you can read in the back, but we don't have time to go through all those arguments. You get lost in the discussion. And it's easier to read. So we rated it as high at 300,000. The planned coalitional aggression moved from very low to low. They're developing their planned coalitional aggression. Conscience is low, but it's still increased from the chimpanzee a lot, And this low rating is also for the other psychological traits. Then at 135,000 years ago, with the onset of full language abilities, this will be the onset of full activity of the 4 behaviors. It's starting at 135, so the rating is changing. Anger aggression is up to moderate. Really, you can see all of the ratings for all of them are rated as moderate due to these developments at 135,000 years ago associated with language. Then today, we really jump from moderate rating to 2 jumps in the case of the anger aggression, the first one there, from moderate to very low. And likewise for all of the psychological traits being rated, they have this big jump from moderate to either very high or very low. That's really the crux of the argument then, was this rating of the psychological abilities and comparing it with the chimpanzee and our different ancestors. So to finish up the part 3, we're going to talk about further support for the 4 behaviors to try to address some of your skepticism. I'm sure you're feeling quite a bit of skepticism about this. So we'll do we got quite a bit by, we developed, I think the first to develop a feedback model on this, the 4 behaviors. And then we've gone into it, try to explain identical twin studies and the whole issue of personal experience, try to relate that to the 4 behaviors and applications in psychology. And then we'll finish up talking about language, aesthetics, and free will, which was the topic of the talk. So for the feedback model, and I'll ask you to address your questions about this to Charles. He's a mathematician, and this is his model, so he has to defend it. And so here we're looking at negative feedback processes on the left, which was particular anger aggression. And then the positive feedback processes are virtually all the other traits, the other 9 traits that we've been listing. And then kind of going from top to bottom, we're looking at the early hominids from 7 million years to 300,000 years ago. And then the red at the bottom is 300,000 to the end of the last ice age. And then next is we're saying that the early selection processes were really, up to 300,000 years ago, were really proto-4 behaviors. And the full 4 behaviors, if you can read it there, were for the 300,000 years and on. And in the feedback processes, as Charles can explain to you very well, it's this idea that things just aren't linear. It really takes, development of language and so forth for this to take off. And then once it takes off, then the selection pressures are so much greater. And the changes in our adaptations are so much greater. Likewise, for the positive feedback, is with the other traits. They started low in the, after our common ancestor with the chimpanzee, and then they increase with time. And then we see the double arrow there that just highlights the fact that, we're really arguing that these are the most complex processes that have ever been observed in nature. And so that's one of the big arguments that we're trying to develop in our publications. And then it results in, early on, as the limited development of psychological traits from the 4 behavior, and in red, complete development of our psychological abilities. Moving on then to the identical twin studies. Are you familiar? If you watch the YouTubes on identical twins, it's just amazing. These 2 people, and they seem like the same person. And the conclusions of identical twin studies are that 50% of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors come from our genes. Basically what we've been talking about, the evolution from the 4 behaviors. But there's another 50% that comes from our learning, childhood, development, and culture. How can this be? So here's the explanation from the 4 behaviors. First, the 50% of our genes are as predicted from the previous slides. However, the second 50%, our learning and culture, is also explained by the 4 behaviors. So the mortal and reproductive dangers from the 4 behaviors had the strong natural selection for prolonged child development and learning from culture. Really, lots of corollaries can come out of this, but one of them is that all our learning abilities come from the 4 behaviors. Thinking next about personal experience in the four behaviors. Now, we don't experience life as we're talking and moving about from any of the things that we've been talking about. We really experience from the idea of autonomy, moral agency, free will. We guide our own behaviors. That's the way we feel. Our psychology is set up that. But this is also explained by the four behaviors. So for the bullet, the mortal and reproductive dangers of the four behaviors produce selection for experiencing life with autonomy, moral agency, and free will. Going on, let's talk about potential applications of this really radical and new explanation of why we are the way we are. Well, it helps us to understand the origin of all our personal experiences and why we love music so much. 2, explains why we are so different from other species. And 3, for applications in psychology, it helps to explain our abilities, language, aesthetics, and conscience. And in the area of mental health, we think it's going to have a major impact. And let's talk about the title of the talk, Language, Aesthetics, and Free Will. It's listed on the left there. And ratings from the prior slides was they're rated in us as very high. In the case of language, you're familiar with that. Conceptual and abstract thinking we're the only species that has this, and we're rated very high. Aesthetics, just think about that cave art. When Picasso came out of that cave art, he said, "This is not only the first art that's ever made, it's the best art." And you look at that, the French cave art, and I agree with him 100%. They're just fantastically beautiful, inspiring. Free will, you think about our moral conscience, moral decisions, really limited biases. Biases have been the criticism of human free will. But Wrangham has a wonderful discussion. He says, our biases are so limited that it really is not obstruction to say we have free will. In contrast, we say, the chimpanzee does not have free will. It has very highly stereotyped behaviors. They do the exact same thing every day. They just, with their limited psychology, we say they have limited or no free will. Whereas we're saying with our moral decisions and conscious making, we have very high free will. So really the concluding statement is our language, aesthetics, and free will evolved by natural selection pressures from the four behaviors and their mortal and reproductive dangers. The first 2 sentences on the first slide is our hypothesis that we're writing our 5th paper on this, and that's going to be our opening argument in that 5th paper. I think it's really an important way of thinking about it that, really, as you're sitting there, all of your thoughts, reflections, activities are really directly related coming out of the natural selection from the 4 behaviors. Now, that's an extremely strong statement. It's a causative type of statement that you very rarely see in social science, psychological research. And we hope to make that argument very strong in terms of not saying it's associated, but saying it's a direct causal effect. I mean, if this is true, you're talking about reorganizing the whole field of psychology to put it under this organization of the effects, the after effects of the 4 behaviors. Thank you very much. We'll open up for discussion.
What societal role did cave art play?
The aesthetic abilities of these people. A lot of the cave art is attributed to shamans, and which are the leaders of the society, of the hunter-gatherers. And I would just say more than anything else, it's an organizing process that's associated with the 4 behaviors. And this idea of a culture in hunter-gatherers where high-quality behavior is highly regarded. And the cave art is one example of that high-quality behavior. Look at those arrow blade, the napped arrow blade stone tools. You could spend a lifetime and you would not nap such a beautiful arrowhead. It's a very difficult. So, it's a representative of the high quality behavior.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what I think is enormous variation in the behaviors of the existing current Homo sapiens and how that might relate to the model.
We know in our modern societies, it's characterized as virtually all the cultures are different, as opposed to in the hunter-gatherer societies, it's amazingly uniform. All people living on Earth before the internet were migratory hunter-gatherers, which is really important for having evolutionary, natural selection changes. In our modern cultures, every culture is different. Now, the idea of the differences in cultures really comes out of the 50% of the identical twin studies that showed our upbringing and culture produces 50% of our thoughts and behaviors and emotions. So that's the culture. That's the basis of basically all culture. Is the learning that goes on. In all the rest of the animal kingdom, very little learning is going on. Our extreme amount of learning is associated with cultural development and culture, and those cultures have expanded since the end of the last ice age to be the multitude of differences that we have today. It all comes out of that 50% of the identical twin studies of coming from our culture and learning.
Seems like your model starts with the hunter-gatherers, starts with targeting the hitters, so that it's not good to be a hitter. You're not going to have as many children. How would our ancestors moving from the forests into savannas make them more likely to target the hitters? What would have really started that? And my second question is, how do bonobos fit into this model? Because my understanding is that they're very similar to chimpanzees, but much, much less violent and aggressive.
How does this kind of get started? With the first, our first fossils at 300,000 years ago. It looks like the trigger is language. With the development of language, because it's really, look at those behaviors, those 4 behaviors that are causing our natural selection. These are extremely complicated social behaviors. They require language. And it's that language, also it's that language effect that allows the coalitions to talk among themselves and come to a conclusion and be sure that everybody's going to agree with them. And so to answer the first question, it's associated with the onset of language. The second question for bonobos is Dr. Wrangham's work with the bonobos has really shown a different perspective on the bonobos. Now, the chimpanzee is hitting 500 times more than we are. The bonobos moved into a different tropical forest area without gorillas that changed their adaptations quite a bit, and they moved from the male dominance of the chimpanzee to the female dominance of the bonobos. But hitting was only reduced by 50% to 250 times more than us. So even with these extremely strong, large changes in social behavior, the aggressive behaviors were only reduced by 50% to 250 times more than we have. So that if you can get our paper, that's a big part of our argument for estimating the different levels that we did with our rating scale.
Anger aggression in chimpanzees, which is very high, and the plant coalition aggression which is very high in Homo sapiens. Could you explain the difference between the two of them?
A large part of Dr. Wrangham's book is characterizing these two different types of aggression in us. For example, the chimpanzee only has reactive aggression. The planned coalitional aggression is pretty much absent in the chimpanzee. But really this idea of, I mean, you've probably all heard the Rousseau-Hobbes debate about, aggression and looking at world history and so forth. And he really explains that they both got it totally wrong. They both got it totally wrong. We have two types of aggression, this reactive aggression and planned aggression. Now, if you think about it, first-degree murder is planned aggression. Second-degree murder is this reactive aggression.
I know that.
You think of warfare, and it really, he equates the planned aggression to, warfare is an example of planned aggression. So it's evil. He really, the evil things that occur in the world really he equates with the planned aggression, and being warfare as being the example of that. Is that enough of that? But
well, Homo sapiens were able to make coalitions, get together with other people,
right.
in order to ostracize somebody from the community.
Exactly. It really takes this language and really the development of all of our psychological abilities to have the planned aggression. Wonderful discussion on that. The many different aspects of the planned and reactive aggression, and it really provides an important insight in how we think about society and what we want to do to make a better society.
I have really a follow-up because I thought you said these 4 behaviors have now stopped for us, but how could the planned organized aggression of the military not be one of those 4 behaviors? That is still obviously very, very, a very strong force in our behaviors.
Clearly, we are capable of all 4 of these 4 behaviors. We're capable of having, coalitional aggression, anger, and these other things. But and the egalitarianism, it's just that we do not choose to. I mean, they're certainly available in our psychology, but our societies are hierarchical. With the farming, became highly hierarchical up until really just the last 200 years with modern society, which is much less hierarchical than the farming, but it's still hierarchical. And the egalitarianism has really gone by the wayside. It's a very difficult way to live socially, egalitarianism. And people chose immediately, within a couple hundred years after the end of the last ice age, the farming started, there was virtually no more egalitarianism going on. People like us, like you, they all choose to live in a hierarchical society, not an egalitarian society. Now, we have the abilities of the 4 behaviors and be egalitarian. We just choose not to, if that clarifies the point.
I'm interested in how this research clarifies the very basic psychological concept of nature versus nurture.
The primary results for clarifying the nature-nurture issues are settled and explained in the identical twin studies. Only identical twin studies can you kind of resolve questions like that. And the findings of identical twin studies is 50% of how you feel, how you act, your emotions come from your genes. Clearly what we're saying is all of our genes for our psychological abilities, for example, our personality and things like that, all came from the 4 behaviors. 4 behaviors. The other 50% comes from our childhood and upbringing in our culture. So when you make a decision or you do something, half of the causal effect of what you decide to do comes from your genes, and half comes from your nurture. So nature is the genes, nurture is your culture and childhood prints. 50% nature, 50% nurture.
What I picked up here is that when you do your community, you have to adapt to the circumstances. If you're a small tribe, hunting, gathering, and even when you get into farming, somebody else, you have to be careful how you adapt to other people living elsewhere, cooperate with them or not. So we do have the ability to be one united nation, one united people, based on, being the same country. But then you also have, if you're cut off with knowing everybody else, which has happened recently with our communication, we don't have a standard TV show or something. And that's what's starting these little individual coalitions. But this is not adaptable because you just end up destroying everything and then start over again. And you've really got to expand your tribe to include everybody, and this is what the problem is right now.
If you do chat GTP on evolutionary psychology and hunter-gatherers, at the bottom they have references. Our paper is coming up like the first reference, so we're very excited about that. We're really having an impact. In that one, we reanalyzed all of world history from this new perspective of the 4 behaviors. And we think it's really going to impact historical analysis, with the idea that, to answer your second, that all of these issues about democracy and totalitarianism and so forth need to be reconsidered from this perspective of the 4 behaviors. So you were able to hear the talk, and that's correct. Raise your hand. And yeah, there you go. So, well, let's see if it's thumbs up or thumbs down on your general impression of the arguments I was presenting. Well, there you go. That's all I wanted to see.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim, for sharing.